yes, as Megan says, I do quite a lot of research on autistic people's experiences of maternity. And this really came from my own personal experiences. So I was diagnosed as dyslexic in my early 20s, and then in 2019 I was diagnosed as autistic. And neurodivergence is something you either are or you're not. So even though I've only been diagnosed in adulthood, I've always been dyslexic and I've always been autistic. And I had some really unpleasant maternity experiences myself. And that got me thinking, actually, what do we know about autistic people's experiences of infant feeding? So in 2021, I moved to Swansea University to work with Aimee Brown. And I thought, right, this is something I can really get my teeth into. So we started off with a systematic review, and we found that there really wasn't very much known at all. So let me tell you what I'm going to cover today. So I'll give you a little bit of information on autism. You'll notice the beautiful rainbow infinity symbol on the screen, and that is the autistic community's chosen logo, if you like, for autism. So historically, we've seen puzzle pieces being used, but they're actually associated with a hate group that wants to eradicate autism by prenatal testing and abortion for us, and they really don't advocate for autistic people. They advocate for the neurotypical parents of autistic children. So we have this lovely rainbow infinity symbol that you'll see used quite a lot, or sometimes it's in gold, because the letters AU are the beginning of autism, and it's also the chemical element for gold. So after that, I'll go into some background in terms of what we know about autistic infant feeding, and then I'll talk about our methods very briefly, and then some breastfeeding experiences in terms of the positives and the challenges. And the last substantial bit will be thinking about the support that people got with infant feeding, which, if you know anything about UK breastfeeding support, it wasn't great, but we're often not very good in the UK just due to lack of investment, really. So thinking then about autism, and I'm aware I'm looking at my other screen because I don't have this up on here. Ah, there we are. Now I can look like I'm looking at you. So the most recent data estimates that about 3% of people are autistic. So that's 1 in 36 people. And we tend to have differences in communication style and sensory processing. Autism is often lumped in with learning disability in lots of policy documents, but actually 2/3 of autistic people don't have a learning disability. Something that you don't commonly hear is that autistic people in the right environment will flourish, and that we have a really significant ability to feel joy. But despite this, being autistic can be really disabling. So in the UK, the Equality Act says that autistic people are eligible to receive reasonable accommodations, but we don't often. The reason there's a picture of the TV show Parks and Recreation on the slide is that it's been discussed widely on the internet that the entire cast of Parks and Recreation, so the staff working in the City of Pawnee Parks and Recreation Department, are all autistic. So, for example, we see Ron Swanson, who doesn't like to speak to anybody and only wants to eat meat. His deputy director, Leslie Nope, only wants to eat breakfast food, and she is highly, highly productive, but is seen as being a bit too much, even by the people who love her. But the reason that this symbolizes what is right about autism is that everybody finds their place. Everybody is able to succeed because we have this lovely neurodiversity affirming society. So when we don't have that, we know that autistic people commonly have co-occurring mental health conditions. So we tend to have higher rates of depression and anxiety, but there's evidence that that is a rational response to trauma. Other co-occurring conditions that can impact breastfeeding are around hypermobility, dysautonomia, and chronic pain. And we're also more likely to have conditions related to fatigue, so chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID, for example. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I started off with a systematic review of autistic people's experiences of infant feeding, and that was published in the journal Autism last year. We only actually found 8 peer-reviewed articles, and some of them only had maybe 1 paragraph on infant feeding experiences. So we also scoured the internet for grey literature and added some pieces of experiential data. And they're linked at the end. So if you want more of a sense of an autistic person's infant feeding journey, then you can read some of those personal accounts. The findings from our systematic review showed that there was often a strong desire to breastfeed. Autistic people face the same challenges as non-autistic people, so often just not getting enough support, feeling that they might not have enough milk. But there were also some additional challenges, and they relate to autistic bodily differences. So typically autistic people will either have stronger than usual or less than usual senses like proprioception and interoception. So here we're thinking about how our body fits in other spaces, but with interoception, we're thinking about our internal bodily signals. So like hunger, thirst, knowing that you need to go to the bathroom, we tend to not have those very strongly. And actually an interoceptive sense would be around the milk letdown reflex. And the last thing we found was that there was just inadequate support to facilitate getting over those additional challenges that autistic people found. So we developed an online survey for UK-based autistic adults who had been pregnant. And we had modules of questions on accessing healthcare, pregnancy loss, maternity care, and infant feeding. I've literally just finished writing the paper today, which is about to be submitted tomorrow morning. And we had 165 participants who'd given birth, and their demographics showed they were really quite privileged. So most people could speak, over 90% were white, over 2/3 had an undergraduate degree. So even for a UK population, they were really quite privileged without even thinking about autistic people routinely being marginalised in education, so having lower qualifications. So thinking about people's breastfeeding experiences then, in the literature previously, we saw a little bit of emphasis on the positives of breastfeeding, but it really wasn't front and centre. 140 of our participants said that they'd breastfed, and actually 87% had a strong desire to breastfeed, even if there were challenges. And just under half of participants said breastfeeding was positive or enjoyable. And this was on a 5-point Likert scale, so from always to never, and the 2 most positive scale points there. So the first quote on the slide says that the sensation of the baby's body against mine is wonderful and very calming. But this participant carries on to identify a challenge. But I struggle with little hands touching my skin, so I wear nursing tops that cover most of my skin now. And when we were seeing these kind of positive accounts, they frequently had a little caveat of there was an issue, but actually I've identified a solution and I've got over that issue now. We also had people talking really about there being a sense of sensory joy, so that breastfeeding was really comforting, this feeling that you were just there in a pleasant bubble with your baby. And autistic people can get dysregulated. And what that means is if you think of your average autistic person as having a bucket, and the sensory environment not meeting our needs. So for example, the room being too bright will be a bit of something in the bucket, and then maybe you can hear some building work going on. So that's another thing in the bucket. And when the bucket gets full, we're then overwhelmed and we either melt down, so there'll be an explosion of energy, so pacing, shouting, ranting at a significant other, or a shutdown where we really go into ourselves, maybe closing our eyes, making our body small and not being able to talk and interact with people. So self-regulation tools are really important to autistic people to help us to get away from that meltdown. So something good happening will take one thing out of that bucket, and you can then empty your bucket if you can do enough self-regulating activities. We also found that autistic people had often been led to believe that they weren't going to be good parents, but being able to breastfeed their baby, to literally keep their baby alive, you know, just using their body, was a real sense of accomplishment that could also help with those overwhelming feelings. And lastly, several of our participants said having to make bottles of formula would just be unbearable. You know, it would be too much to keep organized, to keep everything sterilized and ready to go. And having a baby crying while they're waiting for a bottle would also be really overwhelming. So that noise of the baby crying that's difficult for all parents could be particularly difficult for autistic people who are highly sensitive to sound. Thinking about some of the challenges for breastfeeding then, the sensory experience of breastfeeding was challenging in a number of ways. So if we think about our senses, when it comes to touch, parents reported feeling touched out. So that is, I've had this baby against my body for so much of the day that I cannot stand any more skin-to-skin contact. And the first quote on the slide says, "I have extreme aversion and my skin crawls sometimes. I have to put her down sometimes as her touching me whilst feeding is too much." So it could be really, really intense, that feeling. Almost half of our participants said that the milk letdown reflex was uncomfortable or painful for them. And in open text questions, participants also said that having wet skin from leaking, or sometimes the sensation of a breast pad, could just feel horrible. And some found the suckling feeling really, really unpleasant. When it came to noise, babies crying were incredibly difficult. And sometimes the suckling noise could feel really unpleasant. But breast pumps, people had a particular hatred for the noise of a breast pump. But despite this, 11% of our breastfeeding participants said that they exclusively expressed. So even though the pump was awful, for quite a lot of participants, it was better than directly breastfeeding. And for all of our participants, distraction helped. So looking at something on your phone, playing a game, watching a video, reading a book, you know, anything that could reduce the intensity of that feeling. And also reducing other demands on them. So not speaking to anybody else, being in a quiet room could make it feel better. On my front slide, you may have noticed that I had an old-fashioned phone. And that's to represent the odd feeling that some of our participants had. So it feeling odd was reported by 11 people in our open text data. And one said, "It felt like I had an old-fashioned telephone ringing in my breasts." I don't know how else to describe it, but thinking about it now, I can feel it again, and I haven't breastfed in over 9 years. So that just, I thought, really summed up how unusual it could feel. And again, we found, as you find with a general population of breastfeeding parents, that breastfeeding can disrupt your existing routines and it can feel incredibly intense. Something that is probably an extra challenge for autistic people is that it means that they couldn't always use their pre-existing coping strategies that have been developed over many years. So, for example, you might often find autistic people will go for a lot of walks, or they'll go running, they'll do something with quite a lot of exercise, or they'll go and spend time in a room by themselves, reading, watching favorite TV shows, just something to remove the demands from the outside world. But with a tiny baby, especially when you're trying to exclusively breastfeed, that wasn't always possible. And as I've already mentioned, there was a real love-hate relationship with expressing, even though for some people it was really important to carry on breastfeeding. So expressing allowed them to meet those goals. When we asked participants about the support that they'd had with infant feeding, we really didn't have a lot of good experiences here. So people talked about receiving not enough information or conflicting information. They talked about staff not listening to them, not appearing to have empathy for their needs, doing things like grabbing their breasts to try to demonstrate breastfeeding, which isn't good for anybody, but actually for an autistic person that might be highly, highly sensitive to touch, that is like absolutely the worst and could spark an immediate meltdown or shutdown. In terms of the more positive things, some people talked about staff who gave them verbal descriptions and watched them feeding. So 2 participants were in neonatal intensive care. So only 3 people talked about getting like excellent support. We had over 150 people talk about breastfeeding. So there really weren't many. Also, in the UK, frequently to get breastfeeding support, you have to phone a midwife or a health visitor, so our specialist public health nurses. So that was a real barrier to getting help when it was needed. And then breastfeeding support groups that in the UK are commonly run by local volunteer breastfeeding supporters. They were, again, kind of love-hate. So people often only got support with breastfeeding from their breastfeeding group. So, for example, we had multiple participants talk about having a tongue tie or a lip tie. We had 3 that had their baby had a cleft palate, and they got their support for that from a breastfeeding support group rather than from their health professional. But actually getting support in a group situation was much more difficult. So we can be really sensitive to background noise. So actually being in a room one-to-one with a breastfeeding peer supporter would be a lot easier for that autistic person than being in a room with other conversations and maybe babies crying in the background. One of the bonuses of breastfeeding peer support groups in the UK is they tend to have a Facebook group to go alongside them. And we had several people saying that in the middle of the night, being able to go on there, talk about issues they were having, and get some emotional support with those was really beneficial. As a response to generally not getting a lot of support with breastfeeding, a lot of our participants spent time reading up on breastfeeding themselves, and they had a lot of academic knowledge. So several people went on to become breastfeeding peer supporters after they'd fed their own babies. But for many, they talked about being able to read something and know it academically, but then struggling to understand what their precise issue was and how to put solutions into practice. So that's a real whistle-stop tour of our data, which hopefully will be published reasonably soon. So to sum up, many autistic people in our sample had a strong desire to breastfeed. And they had some additional challenges to your average neurotypical mother. Seeking support was often challenging, and breastfeeding support often didn't meet autistic people's needs. So some of the recommendations going forward was that healthcare professionals should validate autistic strategies that facilitate breastfeeding, that they should have continuity of carer, and that they should be seen one-to-one. And something that could really help that to happen would be autistic-led training for maternity staff, just so they get away from these stigmatizing views of autism. So thinking back to parks and recreation, you know, actually we can have a society where autistic people flourish. We just need to make the environment around them easier for them to survive in. In terms of next steps, I'm currently trying to pull together a project called Autistic Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond, Your Questions Answered. And we're going to have around 120 short videos about everything to do with antenatal birth and postnatal care, delivered by autistic parents and autistic health professionals. Just to really get some more tailored information out there. So they'll be going up on the Swansea University website, hopefully this summer. And as Megan said at the beginning, I now have 8 years to study everything from 16-year-olds and their reproductive health experiences all the way up to menopause. And so I'm leading that project with 4 autistic research assistants and also a community council of 12 autistic people. So we should have a lot more information on autistic infant feeding in the future. And just a few resources that might be helpful. So I have a Facebook group where you can follow my research. So that's called Dr. Aimee Grant, Autism from Menstruation to Menopause. If you want to read more about this, Alexis Quinn has a brilliant book called Autistic and Expecting. I wouldn't recommend it for your average mother with an average reading ability. It's quite suited to academics and health professionals. And also a brilliant Facebook group called Autistic Breastfeeding, Chest Feeding and Body Feeding. And they're happy for health professionals and researchers to join, and they will help with any kind of issues that parents have that you're supporting with their breastfeeding. The last thing on my slides is a list of autistic people's infant feeding accounts. So Nargis has a copy of my slides and I'm happy for her to send that around to everybody. And that is the end of my talk.